Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hello and welcome back to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thanks for coming along on this journey on this new show that is designed to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to be one of the co-hosts of this show. And today, I am actually going to be joined by Nate Hartman, and he is a professor and department head at Purdue, but he is also the past president of the newly founded Digital Enterprise Society. And we're going to have a great conversation with Scott Hutcheson, who is a faculty member at Purdue and the associate director of Purdue's Agile Strategy Lab. We're going to talk about Agile, and we're going to talk about strategies and distributed collaboration. This is going to be fun. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Thom. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Thom, it's great to be talking with you.
Sure. Scott, why don't you kind of fill us in on who you are?
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. I am working in the area of the science and practice of complex collaboration. I'm a social scientist by training, so I look at the human side of these complex technical and social challenges that our organizations and communities face.
And Nate, how about yourself? Where do you come from and why are you here today?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, I'm a department head and professor at Purdue University in the Department of Computer Graphics. You also mentioned that I was the past president of the Digital Enterprise Society. So in that role, I act as sort of a liaison and an ambassador to that particular organization. My area of expertise is really in product lifecycle management and digital enterprise transformation.
So all of this technology, it's having real effects on businesses. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's have a conversation about this.
Yeah, absolutely, Thom. So where Scott and I want to go today with this conversation is, just as you said, it centers on the organizational and human aspects that surround the selection, the implementation, and the use of these kinds of technologies. In the manufacturing community and in the PLM portion of it in particular, people get often really fixated on tools and process, and they often either forget or in some cases minimize this idea of the practice, work practices in particular of the organization, and how people interface with technology to get work done. So we really want to explore some of those aspects in today's session, because those historically are often where many of the challenges as well as many of the opportunities for success can lie. So let's go ahead and start off with maybe just a baseline sort of a question with Scott. Talk to us a little bit about how you view organizational transformation in the context of the high technology that we see today in a lot of organizations, not the least of which is manufacturing.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Let me take you back to a really early time in my career. One of my first jobs out of school was on a technology project, and it happened to be a pretty interesting one in the airline industry. And it was 4 organizations kind of coming together to design and execute a technology solution that they could all use. And a lot of the work had been done before we even got on the job. In fact, there was 75,000 pages of functional specifications, if I remember correctly. And I believe I calculated once, if you kind of stood that up with reams of paper, it's like 35 feet. So it gives you an idea of, a lot of the recipe was already defined. And we were given 4 years to execute this thing, 400 people put on the project, and about $115 million to put it together. And we got about 3.5 years in and got to integration testing, where we were taking the different pieces of it that different groups were working on, and we started to stitch it together to turn on the button for the first time. And guess what? It didn't work. And as it turns out, it never worked. And it's gone down in history as one of the largest software development failures in the history of software development. And, you know, it was my first job, so it was quite a resume builder, if you know what I mean. But as it turns out, the failure had absolutely nothing to do with the technology. The technology was completely feasible. And if you had asked kind of each person in the project, they all wanted it to work. They all recognized the need for it, but it didn't work. So it really kind of set me on the path of trying to figure out why. And over the years, I think we've begun to realize that when these things fail, more often than not, it's a people problem, and it's a human systems problem. So that, I think, is sometimes what we're facing when technical solutions seem to be a whole lot more difficult to implement and execute, if not successfully, like in my case, at least, you know, fully with full impact as it could be. So I've spent kind of my career focusing on, you know, why that is and how you can increase the productivity of the implementation of technical solutions into these very human systems.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example. And in this space around digital manufacturing and digital enterprise tools, one of the tool sets and collections of tools that often comes up in the conversation has to do with product lifecycle management. And this particular area of software development, some people really, really like it. Some people really, really don't. And however, it is often a tool set that is highly customizable and highly configurable, yet that is often where people sometimes run into challenges. And then those challenges often center around the desire that the organization has to capture their process and practice inside the interface or inside the workflow of the tools. And so, you know, whether it's based on that example that you just gave, or whether it's based on a different example, talk to us a little bit about, from an Agile strategy perspective, how we can overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you see a couple of dynamics that come into play. One is that a lot of times these technical solutions are, people feel like they're kind of forced upon them. And they kind of like the way things worked before. They don't necessarily see the need. There's difficulty adapting the way in which they work and the way in which they think about their work and the way in which they, you know, work with others. So figuring out a way to both, yes, you know, when part of the organization recognizes there's the technological need for a new set of tools, but also engaging throughout the enterprise and designing the way in which those tools will be used is an important element too. So how do you have both strong leadership but widespread engagement, and that can create a real challenge. So we focus on, you know, how do you do both? So, you know, going back to my example from earlier in my career, sure, yeah, there were all these specifications handed to a group of people to execute, but the recipe was almost too tightly defined. It didn't give any people any leeway or any choice in the way in which it's implemented, so there wasn't a sense of ownership of it. There's a phenomenon in the research called the IKEA effect. And it says that, you know, when we buy a piece of IKEA furniture, which everyone knows isn't the greatest quality of furniture, it's not heirloom stuff that's going to last forever. Since we have a hand in building it, we value it more than we otherwise would. So even when a new technical solution is handed to us, if we have a hand in the way in which it's implemented throughout our enterprise, we're going to have a higher level of engagement and probably a higher level of adoption at its fullest.
Okay, and so let's go with that point a little more. And you know, historically, organizations, whether they be large or small, were often hierarchical in nature. That was the traditional managerial structure for how organizations worked. A lot of times, particularly manufacturers, large OEMs, multi-division, multi-departmental OEMs were often structured this way. And that worked up to a point, particularly when things happened to be geographically located in the same place. It was easy to manage that kind of a structure and that kind of a relationship. However, as our technology tools have become more advanced and our ability to share information much more widely, and in fact, many of these tools today are designed and developed in a way that allows for this democratization of information, if you will, that often runs headlong into this hierarchical structural model of the way companies are organized. So one of the things that I know your work focuses on has been this idea of newer organizational models, newer collaborative models for basically a workplace in which people are geographically distributed, in which work is often shared, and sometimes a person might be a leader, other times they might simply be a team member. I guess talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an interesting time in organizations right now, especially those that have this history of being organized hierarchically, because there are certain functions within our organizations that work really well in hierarchies, and we need them for lots of good reasons. But there are other functions that don't work at all hierarchically, and they need to be done in these much more open, loosely connected networks. So it makes our organizations have to be ambidextrous, have to be good in hierarchies and good in networks, and it almost seems like the two are like completely opposed to one another. So recognizing which functions are best done in networks and which functions are best done in hierarchies is kind of step one. And then step two is having a different set of tools and disciplines and approaches that are appropriate for each. Because I think for a long time, what we've tried to do is to use the tools and processes that work great in hierarchies to try to use those same tools and processes in these functions that are best done in networks. And that's where we're running up against the wall. We're saying, well, my gosh, it just doesn't work. What seems like, yeah, it should be complicated, but it seems like it's impossible. So I think when you have people talking about design thinking, agile, that's what they're alluding to, is there's this different set of tools that we need to be just as skilled at using in these more open network situations than when we are hierarchical. So whether we're trying to innovate, whether we're trying to change, any sort of strategic transformation is best done in that flatter organizational structure. So, so maybe the future of organizations is going to be circular. It's going to be circular, in which there is some structure. It's not just a free-for-all, but you've got a core set of assets kind of in the middle. You have, 3 or 4 to 5 kind of focus areas around the core. And then you have different units around the perimeter, and porous boundaries in which other organizations can come in and out as needed, whether that's across your supply chain or sometimes even with competitors. And when we make the digital transformation, it can actually help enable that sort of collaboration.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point, because a lot of the selling points, at least for this idea of digital transformation, especially as it relates to making digital the types and the forms of information that we use, has been the ability to share, the ability to collaborate. Yet it often seems as if the organizational structure, if not the organizational process and practice, inhibits that. Not because anybody necessarily sets out to do it that way, but it's just a matter of the organization is used to operating, used to functioning in a particular way. And so it fails to see this idea that things might actually be circular as opposed to hierarchical.
Yeah. We've done a lot of look at how prevailing metaphors impact the way in which we think about everything. And the dominant metaphor for the last 75 or 100 years, or even more, has been the machine. So we've designed our organizations. I mean, we've even designed our communities to kind of function and think a lot like machines. I mean, an org chart looks a whole lot like kind of a process diagram, right? With flows of information and dependencies. Whereas really most of what we experience in life operates more like an ecosystem. It's way less predictable than we would like to think. I think 200 years from now, we will look back at the industrial age and say, how silly we were to think that everything operated like a machine, when all of history before, and I think all of history ahead of us, will tell us, no, stuff works like ecosystems. It is systems that help us understand the way things function. I think that's what we're getting at when we say, well, we need to flatten the hierarchy. Well, I think that's what we're saying, is that we recognize that, things do operate a little bit more like these complex adaptive systems than what we've been thinking for the last 75 or 100 years, since Frederick Douglass Frederick Taylor did his thing with scientific management, right?
Right. And so when you think about one of the, I can reflect back to, middle to late 1980s and 90s, people talked about concurrent engineering or concurrent product and process design. And that became this mantra, so to speak, for that decade or so, where people were creating products and launching them in a certain way. It was followed up by, Lean and Six Sigma and operations optimization and things of that nature. But yet it almost seems as if each one of those, in some respects, were not necessarily hung up by technology per se, as much as they might have been hung up by this idea that people were not necessarily seeing organizations as systems,
right,
as opposed to seeing them as hierarchies. I think about, we often in this community, this manufacturing community, often tend to draw the life cycle of a product in some sort of circular fashion, and recognizing the functional areas of the life cycle of a product as an ecosystem, if you will. Yet our tools at times will allow point-to-point communication in a linear fashion. Other times they allow sort of point-to-many or many-to-point access to information. So how does that behavior, if you will, of the technology square with this idea of organizations being ecosystems? Because a lot of people would say, well, we've never really reached the promise of concurrent product and process design or concurrent engineering, because our tools only allow this point-to-point communication of information. And while that may be true, or it may be a contributing factor, I also wonder how much of this is organizational and human behavior.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is. And one of the reasons I think it's difficult to make this transition in so many organizations is because we simply haven't been able to visualize it and come up with some set of guidelines or a set of rules, if you will, to understand it. And it may sound funny to talk about rules within an ecosystem, but we know that systems have rules. If you think about, if you've ever seen a swarm, whether it's a swarm of swallows or whatever, kind of meandering through the sky, you can find those videos. They've identified there are about 3 rules that govern that behavior. And those 3 rules are: don't fly too close to your neighbor, don't fly too far from your neighbor, and go in the same general direction as your neighbor. And you see that beautiful sort of swarm, take place. So part of the work that I've been engaged in over the last few years is try to identify a similar set of rules that govern the behavior of these organizational ecosystems. And we've come up with 10. It's probably not, the be all end all, but we've identified kind of 10 rules for complex collaboration, if you will. Okay. And they mirror the way things kind of function in an ecosystem. So let me just kind of give you an example of a couple of those rules.
Okay.
So one rule is related to this. We we frame conversations around appreciative questions. So you think about, so often in our organizations, most of our conversations are problem focused. We get together because we've got a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But in an ecosystem, the right kind of appreciative question, so one that draws people to it, is kind of like the watering hole in an ecosystem. It brings the species to it. So, instead of, a question like, why don't our customers get excited about our projects anymore? Or, our products anymore? That's a very problem-centric conversation. An appreciative question might be, well, what would it look like if our customers were absolutely delighted again about the products that we provide to them? Well, that opens up the aperture, if you will, for a whole different kind of conversation. And then you find people who are attracted, well, who would be attracted to that conversation? Well, our customers would, our suppliers would, people all over our organization would. And then that launches us into, I won't go into the other 9 rules, but that launches us into using the other 9 rules to generate a set of strategies and solutions to help us get a better understanding of what indeed would that look like, and how would we test our hypotheses that that's what it would look like. So it's kind of this, it can be the same deal when you have a technological digital transformation that you're trying to make. What would happen if we reframed what life in our organization and in our industry would look like after we make the digital transformation, and then figure out what our pathway to that future that we would all like to see realize.
Yeah, I think that would resonate with a lot of people in our community that might watch this or listen to this podcast, is that, a lot of times that digital transformation is very much focused inward on what we do as a company, or maybe what we don't do as a company, but yet we don't often think of it in the context of that, like you said, that appreciative inquiry, that appreciative question of how might things be better, both internally and externally, if we did X, fill in the blank. Usually in that case, it's, okay, so if we successfully implement this tool, and if we successfully change our process and practice, what might things look like?
Right, exactly.
And I think sometimes people get too caught up in checking the boxes as opposed to understanding the implication for the larger system.
Yeah, this brought something to mind, and I'm not trying to make a book plug, but Nate's a common friend of both you and me, a guy by the name of Don Cooper. Don? Yeah. So Don at the PTC Global Rockwell Alliance. Well, Don wrote an endorsement of a book that I contributed to about this topic. And what you said kind of reminded me of what Don said. So Don's blurb was this. He said, "The convergence of the physical and digital worlds, especially in manufacturing, presents unprecedented opportunity for the creation of transformational value. With all the chess pieces on the table, there are seemingly unlimited numbers of opportunities. And leaders need new skills and insights to chart a pathway forward." So I think that's really insightful, in that when we make the digital transformation, it's almost overwhelming, the possibilities that it presents to us. So having a disciplined approach to not only make the transformation, but see the other side of the transformation, that holy cow, the opportunity for creating additional value is going to be absolutely unlimited when we successfully make this transformation. And when we can see that, then come hell or high water, we're going to make it. We're going to do what it takes to make it.
Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges companies often have, though, is because it does seem really daunting, and it does seem like such a big undertaking to take on. There is sometimes this paralysis by analysis type of an aura that tends to pervade the discussion, at least initially sometimes, is people don't quite know in some cases, where to start with the digital transformation. And in some cases, if they've managed to get started, they're not quite sure exactly where they are. They're out wandering in the wilderness somewhere, but they have no semblance of where the path is. They left the path a long time ago. And so, I know that you've worked on something called Agile strategy that is at least a way to help organizations begin to undertake a transformation, regardless of what domain they happen to be in. However, maybe walk us through the high-level steps on Agile strategy and how that might help manufacturers do this digital transformation.
Sure. Let me embed the walkthrough in a real life example. So we were working with a fairly large, defense supplier. And they had been challenged by the Navy, in this case, to design a digital solution on top of a Navy ship. And they recognized they didn't have all the expertise that they needed to do this. So they looked to an Agile strategy kind of process to do that. So first they started with a framing question, like what we just talked about. What would it look like if our Navy ships were smarter? And what would it look like if we could better predict things were going to break down before they broke down? Okay. So they had that framing question, and that framing question attracted a new ecosystem with them in the center, but all these smaller, more specialized companies offering sub-solutions around machine learning, new sensor technology, data analytics, user interface, all those kinds of things. But still, that's pretty daunting. So the approach that they used would identify what assets are available in this new ecosystem, how those assets might be linked and leveraged to create new strategic opportunities within the context of that framing question, and then very quickly identify what we call a pathfinder project. So it's not the whole thing, not the whole enchilada. It's in this case, kind of a proof of concept or a pilot. So drawing from Agile software development. What's a subcomponent or a subsystem within this larger system that we could all put our hands on, test our hypotheses that if we do this, we'll have better predictive capacity. And by gosh, let's see what we can learn in the next 90 days. So that's exactly what they did. So they started with a smaller, more bite-sized pilot, but it wasn't just low-hanging fruit. It was, I sometimes describe it as the tastiest piece of the different pieces of fruit that were hanging low. So we guide people into choosing what we call the big easy, the potentially big transformational pathway, but the one that's kind of relatively easy for us to execute on. And what that does is it bolsters your ability to do complex work together, allows you to gather some data, because we do this thing and we test it out and we see if it worked in this smaller scale, how do we then take it to the next scale? And then it allows you kind of to present, in this case, to the Navy of, hey, look what we're able to do now in this smaller scale. Now we're able to do it more. So that combination of the right framing question to bring the assets together that need to be brought together, and then zeroing on that big easy pathfinder project is a good way to move forward.
Okay. And as companies go about executing that, it almost seems as if because of the new ecosystem created, because of early successes, we now have an opportunity to possibly begin that shift between being a more hierarchical organization to being a more circular and systems-oriented organization. I mean, do you think that's a fair statement?
I do. And again, I don't think hierarchies are going to go away, because there are some functions that are best served in hierarchies. So we sometimes use the analogy. So picture you've got 3 different hierarchies, thinking about collaborating on something. Well, they each come with their own cultures, their own sets of carrots and sticks, their own allegiances, and each of them have an immune system. I mean, we build these organizations to have an immune system. When they feel threatened, they fight back. So we've come up with this metaphor of, well, what if you take this new collaborative platform and kind of slide it underneath the hierarchies and migrate just a few assets of the hierarchy onto the new platform and see are we able to do more, better, more innovative work, faster work on the platform? And if we are, and that's fairly evident, then we figure out how to migrate more assets from the hierarchy to this collaborative platform. And then I think if you do that over time, you will still have some assets in the hierarchy. You will still have some assets on this, circular, flatter platform as well. And some of those assets can even play on both of those playgrounds, if you will. They can become more agile, more ambidextrous to know, all right, well, this asset can work this way in the hierarchy, but it can also work this way in the network. And when we talk about organizations being agile, I think that's what we mean. How do we deploy assets, both in hierarchies and in networks? And those networks, those flat networks, aren't static either. I mean, we may have assets working on 3 different platforms, and that sort of mindset allows you to do that.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
So I have a couple questions for both of you before we sort of wrap this up, because we've taken this at kind of a really high level. And for the people who are listening, I always like to make sure that we take the discussion down to, how does this impact my career, the person who's listening? So as you talk about all of this stuff and getting all these things to collaborate and getting all the different levels, what advice do you have for the individual who's trying to go about their life and grow a career? What should they be doing to make sure they're positioning themselves correctly?
Nate, you want to start, or you want me to?
Yeah, well, I think from my perspective, I'll go back to something I said towards the beginning, which was many people in this space have high degrees of technical knowledge. And whether it's about a particular process or a particular tool or a particular phenomenon that exists in the design and manufacturing supply chain type spaces. One of the challenges, I think, given that propensity towards a technical mindset is sometimes the challenges people face in collaborating, in interacting, and in thinking in an ecosystem manner as opposed to an individualized manner. And so I think from a career development perspective, I would suggest that people, in as much as they are able to, try to adjust their mindset, try to adjust towards a more ecosystem mindset rather than an individualism mindset.
Yeah, Nate, to build on that, so Thom, Nate, and I both work for the same dean, Dean Bertolini. And Dean Bertolini at Purdue talks a lot about the T-shaped professional, whether you're an engineer, some other kind of technologist, the up and down part of the T, the vertical T. Well, that's what we spend our time at Purdue, our 4 years, building those technical competencies. But then the horizontal part of the T, or the stuff that we're talking about now, it's the ability to think horizontally, it's the ability to understand innovation and to be able to collaborate. So historically, we haven't done as good a job. We thought of those things as either one or the other. We had our vertical disciplines, and then maybe we had some horizontal disciplines over in liberal arts, thinking about history and sociology, and now we don't have the luxury of it being an either or. We need technologists who are also able to be both the vertical thinkers, but also the horizontal thinkers. And the good news is we're doing a better job articulating what are those more horizontal competencies and how do we actually teach them. And the good news is you don't need 4 years to teach them. What we have determined in working with people from across lots of different vertical disciplines is it's a relatively thin layer of training and skills that someone can develop to give them just enough to be able to, look up and down, but also, look horizontally. So my advice would be to seek out the people who are developing and doing the best thinking in that kind of horizontal space and build your capacity to do that. And that's the space that my colleagues and I work in. And we've seen it time and time again that you can take a very technical focused vertical thinker, add another layer of that kind of horizontal tools, processes, and mindsets, and increase the productivity of what they're able to do.
And Scott, I'll wrap up the point in saying it's interesting in that if we sort of flip that point around and look at it from the other way, this digital transformation that's occurring, within this fourth industrial revolution is going to, I think, require people who may not otherwise come from a very technical background. This will cause them, I think, to have or to develop a certain amount of technological literacy that will be needed to cross over that horizontal portion of that T-shaped professional. So I think it goes the other direction as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep.
Well, fascinating. This was a great conversation. Each week, we really try to bring to this podcast interesting interviews and conversations and ideas that are going to help the listeners enhance and grow their careers. So thank you both for coming on and participating here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Any last words?
Thanks for having us, Tom.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for having us. As always, great conversation, and we'll look forward to the next time.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Join us next week for more thoughts, ideas, and information in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the continued exchange of ideas of digital manufacturing tools. Check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digital